There is a particular kind of silence that lives in houses where love has been withheld for a very long time. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of contentment. It is the silence of a person who has learned, slowly and completely, that speaking costs more than they can afford. The silence of someone who has trained herself to take up as little space as possible, to eat quickly, to move quietly, to smile when she is looked at, and to look away when she is not needed. Nadia Ashworth was 21 years old, and she had been living inside that silence for as long as she could remember. She told herself it was fine. She had a roof. She had a place at Coventry University studying social sciences. She had a small bedroom at the back of her Uncle Gerald's house on Whitmore Park Road, the room that had once been a storage room, that still smelled faintly of old cardboard and damp, that had a window too high up the wall to see out of unless she stood on her desk chair. She told herself, this is enough. This is more than nothing. She had been telling herself this for 18 years. What she did not tell herself, what she could not afford to examine too closely, was the thing that happened on Tuesday evenings when her cousin Marcus came home late from wherever Marcus went, and the house was quiet, and her Aunt Linda was already in bed, and she heard his footsteps slow outside her door. She had a chair wedged under the handle now. She had learned to do that in the dark, silently, so the sound wouldn't carry. She had learned a great many things in the dark. She did not speak of this. She had tried, once, when she was 16. Her Aunt Linda had looked at her for a long moment with her pale, flat eyes and said, "Where else would you go, Nadia? Who else would have you?" That had been enough. So she was quiet. She was careful. She kept her head down and her grades up, and she counted the months until she could finish her degree and leave this house and never come back. She was good at surviving. She had been doing it since she was 3 years old, which was the age she had been when her parents died. Or so she had always been told. The house on Whitmore Park Road was large by Coventry standards, a detached Victorian with bay windows and a driveway, and a garden that Linda kept immaculate from March to October and ignored completely the rest of the year. Gerald Ashworth ran a property management company with 12 employees and a glass-fronted office on Corporation Street. They had 2 cars. They had holidays in Portugal every summer. Their son Marcus drove a Audi that his father had bought him for his 26th birthday and wore clothes that cost more than Nadia's entire monthly budget. Nadia had a bicycle. She had a part-time job at the Costa on Barris Lane, 4 shifts a week, 6:30 to midday, which paid for her food, her books, and the small contributions to household expenses that her aunt collected every month in cash and called your share. She did not complain about this. She did not complain about much. Her one true refuge was the university library. She spent more time there than she needed to, not just studying, but simply being in a space where no one knew her history, where she was just another student with a tote bag and a library card and a thermos of coffee. A space where she was nobody's burden and nobody's charity case. Where she was just Nadia. She was good at her course. Her personal tutor, Dr. Fiona Marsh, had told her at their last meeting that she had a genuine gift for qualitative research, the kind of patient, careful listening that most students had to be taught, and some never learned at all. "You pay attention to people," Fiona had said. "That's rarer than you'd think." Nadia had not told her why. In early November, Dr. Marsh assigned the third-year cohort a research project, an oral history interview with a resident of a local care facility. The university had a partnership with Elmwood Lodge, a residential home in Balsall Common, just south of Birmingham. Students were to spend at least 3 sessions with their assigned resident, record the interviews, and write a 3,000-word reflective analysis. Nadia had been assigned a woman named Margaret. That was all the intake form said. Margaret. Age 79. Long-term resident. Willing participant. She drove out on a Tuesday afternoon in November, borrowed the bicycle, took the train from Coventry to Balsall Common, walked the rest, and arrived at Elmwood Lodge as the light was beginning to fail. The building was old stone, set back from the road behind a low wall, and a garden that was bare now but had the bones of something that would be beautiful in spring. The windows were lit warm and yellow. A woman at the reception desk with kind eyes showed her down a carpeted corridor to a small sitting room at the end. Margaret was waiting for her. She was seated in a high-backed chair near the window, with a blanket across her knees and a cup of tea on the small table beside her that she had not touched. She was slight, the kind of slight that speaks of a frame that was once something else, that has been worn down to its essentials. Her hair was silver white and very neat. Her hands, resting in her lap, were the hands of a woman who had once done things with them and now had nothing to do. But her eyes were dark and still and entirely present. Not the vague, glassy presence of someone whose mind had begun to drift, but the sharp, watchful presence of someone who had spent a great deal of time inside her own thoughts and knew her way around them very well. "You must be the student," Margaret said. Her voice was low and precise, with a Birmingham accent that had been softened by time or education or both. She looked at Nadia the way Nadia thought later, turning it over in her mind on the train home, the way someone looks at something they recognize but cannot place. "I'm Nadia," she said. "Nadia Ashworth. From Coventry University. Thank you for agreeing to this." "Sit down," Margaret said. Not unkindly, just directly. "I've been waiting for someone to talk to for quite some time." She said it without self-pity. As a fact. Nadia sat. She took out her recorder and her notepad, and she asked the first gentle questions that Dr. Marsh had suggested: background, family, where she had grown up, and Margaret answered them in her careful, precise way. She had grown up in Solihull. Her father had been an engineer. She had studied literature at Birmingham University in the late 1960s. She had worked as a secondary school English teacher for 11 years. She had married at 31 a man called Robert, and they had been happy, she said, in the way that happiness works when you have chosen wisely and worked at it. "Did you have children?" Nadia asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "A daughter." She said it, and then she stopped, and the weight of the stop told Nadia not to push. She wrote it down. She moved on. But in the car on the way home, the taxi she had splurged on because the last train had gone, she sat in the dark and thought about the way Margaret had said it. A daughter. Present tense. And then the full stop that felt less like an ending and more like a door that had been very carefully closed. She came back the following Tuesday. This time she brought biscuits, shortbread from the Sainsbury's near the station, in a tartan tin. Margaret looked at them for a moment, and something crossed her face that might have been amusement, or might have been something older. "My daughter loved shortbread," she said. "When she was small, I used to make it from scratch on Saturday mornings. She'd stand on a step stool beside me at the kitchen counter and cut the shapes out with a little metal cutter shaped like a star." She said it the way people say things they have kept for a long time. Carefully, as if the memory is fragile. "You don't see her?" Nadia asked gently. Margaret looked at the window. The garden outside was gray and still. "I haven't seen her in 18 years, she said. Nadia did not speak. She waited. She was good at waiting. "There was an accident," Margaret said after a moment. "A car accident. On the A45, coming back from my brother's house in Solihull. A November night," she stopped. "A night very much like this one, actually. It was raining. My husband Robert was driving. My brother Daniel was in the passenger seat." She paused. "There was a collision. A serious one. The room was very quiet. Robert died," Margaret said. "Daniel died." She said it plainly, the plainness of someone who has said something so many times in their own head that the words have been worn smooth, like stones in a river. "I survived. I was in the rear seat. I had injuries. I was in hospital for several weeks." "I'm so sorry," Nadia said. She meant it. "When I came out of hospital," Margaret continued, "my daughter was gone." She turned from the window and looked at Nadia directly. "She was 3 years old. Gerald, that was my brother's wife's husband. Gerald Ashworth had her. He and his wife Linda. They said they had taken her in while I was in hospital. They said they were keeping her." She folded her hands in her lap. "And then Gerald told me," she stopped, took a slow breath. "Gerald told me that if I tried to take her back, he would tell the authorities that I was an unfit mother, that I had a history of mental instability, that the accident had been my fault. He had a solicitor. He had documents. He had," she shook her head slightly. "He had been preparing. I think he had been preparing for some time. Nadia had gone very still. Something was moving at the edge of her mind, like a shape seen through fog. Not yet clear, but there. Did you fight it? She asked. Her voice was very careful. I tried, Margaret said.
For 2 years, I tried.
I had no money. Robert's estate had complications, and Gerald controlled what little there was through a business arrangement he and Robert had. I had a solicitor too, but Gerald's was better, and she paused. I was not well. The grief, the injuries, the loss of my daughter on top of everything. I was not in a condition to fight cleverly. She looked at her hands. And then something happened to my brother's estate. Money I should have inherited from my parents, from Daniel's life insurance. It disappeared into Gerald's company. Legally. With paperwork I didn't understand and couldn't challenge.
She paused.
I ended up here. I've been here for 11 years. Nadia realized she had not been breathing properly. She made herself breathe. Your daughter, she said carefully. What was her name? Margaret looked at her. And for just a moment, a single, still moment, something moved through her expression that Nadia could not name. Not recognition exactly. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. Something that reached toward her across the small room. Nadia, Margaret said quietly. Her name was Nadia. The shortbread tin was still on the table between them. Neither of them moved.
She did not say it that day.
Neither of them said it. Nadia drove home in the taxi with her hands folded in her lap and her mind entirely silent. Not the comfortable silence of the library, but the silence of someone who has picked up a thread and knows, with a certainty that precedes logic, that if she pulls it the whole garment will come apart. She told herself, it's a common name. Nadia is not an unusual name. The accident was on the A45, which runs near Coventry, near Solihull, near all of these places. Gerald Ashworth is not an unusual name. The daughter of the woman in the care home is not necessarily. She stopped. She went to her room. She wedged the chair under the door handle. She sat on her bed and opened her laptop. She searched, Robert Ashworth, Solihull, car accident, A45. It took 11 minutes to find it. A local newspaper archive. Birmingham Mail, November 1997. A brief report, the kind that fills 3 paragraphs and then is forgotten. 2 men killed in A45 collision. Robert James Ashworth, 34, and Daniel Edward Harlow, 31, were killed in a 2-vehicle collision on the A45 near Coventry on Saturday evening. A third passenger, a woman, survived and was taken to hospital. Police are investigating the cause of the collision. Mr. Ashworth is survived by his wife and infant daughter. His wife, Margaret Harlow, Margaret Ashworth, had kept her maiden name in the care home records. Margaret Harlow. But the maiden name of her brother was Daniel Harlow. Gerald's wife was Linda. Linda Ashworth. Nay, Nadia searched, hands unsteady, nay Collins. Gerald Ashworth, born 1961. Birmingham. Gerald Ashworth, who ran a property management company. Gerald Ashworth, who had taken in his dead brother's daughter. Gerald Ashworth, whose wife had told a 16-year-old girl. Where else would you go? Who else would have you? Nadia sat on the edge of her bed in the small back room that smelled of cardboard and damp. The window above her was too high to see out of. The chair was still wedged under the door handle. She was 21 years old. Her mother was alive. Her father had not died in an accident. He had been killed in an accident that Gerald Ashworth had somehow survived without being in the vehicle, that had left him with control of an estate, a business, a child, and money that was not his. She sat with this for a long time. Then she took out her phone. And she called Dr. Fiona Marsh. She went back to Elmwood Lodge on a Friday. She had not told Margaret what she had found. She needed to be sure, fully sure, before she said anything that could not be unsaid. And she needed to do it right. She owed this woman that much. She owed herself that much. She brought shortbread again. The same tin. Margaret was in the same chair. She looked at Nadia when she came in, and the same thing moved in her expression. Closer now, like the fog was beginning to clear, but not clear yet. They talked for a little while about other things. Margaret's teaching years. A student she remembered, 30 years later, who had loved Keats with a ferocity that had made the whole class sit up. The way Birmingham had changed. Small things. The biscuits. Then Nadia set down her recorder. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to know that I'm asking it carefully, not carelessly." Margaret looked at her. "Your daughter," Nadia said.
Nadia.
"Do you have a photograph of her?" Margaret was still for a moment. Then she reached beside her chair to the small canvas bag that she kept there, and she took out a wallet. Old leather, very worn. She opened it and removed a photograph, small, creased at one corner. The colors faded to the warm, soft tones of a photograph that has been looked at many times. She held it out. Nadia took it. A woman and a man, young, mid-30s at most, standing in a garden somewhere, laughing at whoever was behind the camera. Between them, held up on the man's hip, a small child. Dark hair, dark eyes even in the faded photo. A round, serious face in the middle of a smile. Nadia looked at the child in the photograph for a very long time. She had seen that face before. In the mirror, every morning, for 21 years. She raised her eyes to Margaret. Margaret was watching her. And now there was no mistaking what was in her expression. It was not the look of a woman who did not know. It was the look of a woman who had known for 2 weeks and had been waiting, with every careful ounce of patience she possessed, for this moment. "You have your father's mouth," Margaret said quietly. "But your eyes are mine." Nadia's hands were shaking. The photograph was shaking with them. "You knew," Nadia whispered. "The moment you walked in," Margaret said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were full of something enormous and unshed. "Your name, your age, and then the way you listen." Robert listened like that, like he was genuinely inside what you were saying. "Why didn't you?" "Because you needed to find it yourself," Margaret said. "Because if I had told you, a stranger, an old woman in a care home, you would have had no reason to believe me. You needed the thread in your hands."
She paused.
"And because I was afraid." Her voice, on the last word, broke just slightly.
Just at the edge.
"I was afraid that if I said it and you didn't believe me, I wouldn't be able to bear it. I am 79 years old, and I have waited 18 years, and I could not." She stopped, steadied herself. "I needed you to be sure, so that when I told you I was your mother, you already knew it was true." Nadia did not remember crossing the room. She did not remember getting up from her chair. She only knew that she was kneeling beside Margaret's chair with her face against the old woman's shoulder and her hands gripping the sleeve of her cardigan, and Margaret's thin arms were around her, and neither of them spoke for a very long time.
There was no need to.
Dr. Fiona Marsh had a contact. A legal aid solicitor named Claire Devereaux, who specialized in inheritance fraud and elder financial abuse. Nadia had told Fiona only as much as she needed to, that her research interview had uncovered something that might require legal advice. Fiona, who was sharper than most people gave her credit for, had asked no unnecessary questions. Claire Devereaux was a small, precise woman with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the manner of someone who had heard a great many things that were difficult to hear and had not stopped being angry about any of them. She met Nadia and Margaret together, at the care home, on a Thursday afternoon. She listened for 2 hours. She asked careful questions. She looked at the documents Margaret had kept, and Margaret had kept everything, filed neatly in a cardboard box that had lived under her bed at Elmwood Lodge for 11 years. Bank statements, letters from solicitors, a copy of Daniel Harlow's will, the original agreement through which Gerald Ashworth had acquired control of Robert Ashworth's business interest, copies of the police report from the A45 accident. Claire set down the last document. She removed her glasses and looked at them both. "Mrs. Harlow," she said, "the business arrangement alone constitutes what I would consider a clear case of financial coercion and potentially fraud. But there's more here." She tapped the police report. The accident report lists Gerald Ashworth as a witness. A witness, not a passenger. He was at the scene. And his statement, she paused. His statement has inconsistencies that were never followed up because the investigating officer retired 6 months later and the case was closed. "I would like to have someone look at this again." Margaret looked at her steadily. "He was there that night," she said. "He had arranged to meet Robert. They had an argument about the business, about money. I have never been able to prove what happened on that road. But I have always known that the accident was not an accident. The room was very still. Then let's prove it, Claire said. It took 7 months. It was not 7 months of clear, dramatic progress. It was 7 months of documents and meetings and phone calls and waiting, the unglamorous machinery of justice, working the way justice usually works, slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and frustrations and moments where it seemed as if the whole thing might collapse under the weight of 18 years of carefully constructed lies. But Gerald Ashworth had made mistakes. People who believe they have gotten away with something have a tendency to get careless. There were financial records that did not align. There is a witness, a retired mechanic, now living in Shrewsbury, who had never been interviewed, who had been at a garage on the A45 that night and had seen 2 cars parked on the verge before the collision, not one. There were emails, recovered from a decommissioned server, between Gerald and a solicitor who had since been disbarred, discussing the transfer of estate assets in terms that were, as Claire put it with quiet precision, entirely inconsistent with legitimate legal practice. And there was Marcus, who had grown up watching his parents live on money that was not theirs. Marcus, who had spent 26 years being protected by people who had committed a crime that required ongoing maintenance, ongoing lies, ongoing control of Nadia, ongoing management of the fiction they had built. Marcus, who, when the police came to the house on Whitmore Park Road with a warrant, made a decision that his parents had not anticipated. He told them everything, not out of remorse, or not entirely, but because he had spent his whole life benefiting from a secret he had known about since he was 15 and overheard a conversation he was never meant to hear. And the weight of it had been, in its way, its own kind of sentence. Gerald Ashworth was charged with fraud, financial abuse of a vulnerable adult, and unlawful deprivation of an inheritance. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the accident report and the new witness testimony and added a further charge, causing death by dangerous driving. 18 years late, but there. Linda Ashworth was charged as an accessory. Marcus cooperated with the prosecution. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Nadia attended every day, sitting in the gallery with Dr. Marsh on one side and Margaret on the other. Margaret, who had been helped out of Elmwood Lodge for the first time in 4 years, who sat very straight and very still and watched the proceedings with those dark, steady eyes. Gerald was convicted on all counts. Linda received a suspended sentence in exchange for her own cooperation, which was, as Claire had explained, carefully, not a perfect outcome, but a necessary one. It was not a perfect outcome. These things rarely are. But on the evening of the verdict, Nadia and Margaret sat together in the small flat that Claire had helped arrange, temporary housing, while the estate was untangled and Margaret's rightful inheritance began the slow process of being returned, and they ate shortbread from a tartan tin and said very little and did not need to say very much. Nadia finished her degree the following June. At the graduation ceremony in Coventry Cathedral, she sat in her gown and cap and looked out across the rows of seats until she found the face she was looking for. Margaret was there, in the 3rd row, wearing a deep blue coat that Nadia had bought for her white hair very neat, her hands folded in her lap. Beside her was Dr. Marsh, who had agreed to accompany her. When Nadia's name was called and she walked across the stage to receive her degree, she did not look at the vice-chancellor or at the camera. She looked at her mother. Margaret raised one hand. Small.
Steady.
Nadia smiled. Later, she would think about the shape of the thing, the particular and improbable geometry of how it had happened. A university assignment. A care home south of Birmingham. A woman in a high-backed chair with a cup of untouched tea and eyes that looked at her like someone trying to remember a word they had known a long time ago. She thought about what it meant to find someone. Not just geographically, not just the arriving at a room and sitting in a chair and asking questions from a prepared list, but the other kind of finding. The kind that requires stillness. The kind that requires you to pay attention to the thing that is almost but not quite named, the shape behind the fog, the thread that you pick up because something, instinct, need, the part of you that is older than your own memory, tells you to pull. She had been told her whole life that her parents were dead. She had built an entire self on top of that grief. It had shaped the silence she lived inside, the smallness she had learned to occupy, the careful art of taking up as little space as possible. She had been a daughter who did not know she had a mother who knew she had a daughter and could not find her. And between them, for 18 years, a lie, a house, a window too high up the wall to see out of. She did not forgive Gerald Ashworth. She had been asked, once or twice, by people who meant well, whether she planned to. She did not think forgiveness was the right frame. What had been done to her mother, to her father's memory, was not a thing that could be folded up and put away with a word. It was not hers to carry anymore. That was different. What she carried instead was the shortbread tin. The photograph, the faded one, with the man and the woman and the small serious child caught in the middle of a smile. A phone with a contact saved simply as Mum, which she had called every single day since the day she had knelt beside a high-backed chair in a care home in Balsall Common and felt, for the first time since she was 3 years old, that she was entirely, uncountably found.